A king like Artaxerxes, you probably wouldn't want to be the cupbearer, but Nehemiah is the cupbearer, and in this position, he actually has it's the perfect position for him to be in with regards to his one thing, to his one challenge. Let's continue on, bringing the verse back up. Go to the verse, yeah. And then I told him how long it'd be gone, and the king agreed to my request. I didn't remember how far in there we'd gotten. Okay, the next verse. I also said to the king, if it pleases the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, instructing them to let me travel safely through their territories on my way to Judah. And if it please, and please give me a letter addressed to ask the manager of the king's forest, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress and for the city walls and for a house for myself. And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. When I came to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, I delivered the king's letters to them. The king, I should add, sent along an army of officers and horsemen to protect me. But when Sanballat and Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite heard of my arrival, they were very displeased that someone had come to help the people of Israel. We'll stop there. And it's interesting to note that everything is going great for Nehemiah. He's got the king's approval. The king basically gives him a whole band of people. The king actually, as we find out later, makes him the governor of Judah, which is a little bit of a promotion from honored slave or higher person of the slaves to governor. But we can see that even though God hasn't really stepped in to speak or to give Nehemiah this goal or this one vision or the one thing, that God has been slowly answering this prayer that he prayed in chapter 1, that the king would find favor in him. And as we can see from the interaction with the king, God was answering his prayers. Oftentimes, though, as we continue on, Nehemiah is a book that there's a lot of prayers to God, but not a lot of reaction from God. And oftentimes we feel like that in our lives. We pray and pray and pray, but we don't really know whether or not God's actually hearing our prayers. And that's a little disheartening at times. And as Nehemiah makes it to Jerusalem, things are like, he's maybe on a good high, but there's people who don't really want to see him succeed with his one thing, succeeding with the one thing of building the wall. Sanballat and Tobiah are interesting people. They were governors of neighboring provinces, but they enjoyed seeing Jerusalem in rubble and kind of oppressing the Jews because it kind of made them feel more important, and it kind of helped them kind of feel as though they were responsible and in charge of more area than they really were. And as we find out later, if you read through the book of Nehemiah, many of the governors of the province of Judah kind of like rubbed shoulders with them and kind of allowed them to be that and basically oppressed all the people. And Nehemiah reaches Jerusalem, and several days later he kind of sneaks out with a couple people at night. And during the night, it took only a few others with me. I had not told anyone the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. We took no pack animals except the donkey I was riding. Continue. After dark, I went out through the valley gate, past the jackal well over the dung gate to inspect the broken walls and the burned gates. He's basically starting on walking around the outside of the walls of Jerusalem to kind of survey what's ahead, kind of figuring out, okay, where am I actually at here? And went through the fountain gate into the king's pool, but my donkey couldn't get through the rubble. Some of the rubble was that bad. Continuing on verse 15. So still dark, I went up through the Kidron Valley instead and inspected the wall before I turned back and entered again at the valley gate. The city officials didn't know I had been out there, what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. I had not yet spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration. But now I said to them, this is probably either the next morning or a couple days later, you know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem to end this disgrace. Then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me and about my conversation with the king. And they responded, yes, let's rebuild the wall. So they began the good work. Nehemiah cast this vision to rebuild the wall, and everybody rallies around with him. Nehemiah chapter 3 is an interesting chapter. We won't go through it this morning because there's a lot of fun names. If you're not the type of person to like to read kind of Hebrew names out loud, then Nehemiah 3 is not your verse, or not the chapter to read, but in it, it basically goes around the entire wall that they're rebuilding, and we see Nehemiah's leadership in play here because he groups everybody into, pretty much everybody who lived in and around Jerusalem has a section of wall, and they're basically building the wall all at once. And this is part of Nehemiah's leadership. Is he's known from serving in King Artaxerxes' palace. He knows a lot about leadership, and he knows the power of synergy, and he basically taps into this power of synergy because everybody pooling together is much better, much more synergistic, if that's the word, than just one person working by themselves. However, Nehemiah, as we read starting in chapter 4, Sanballat and Tobiah come into the picture. And the first thing they try to do is mock them. Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and decided to mock the Jews. At last the wall was go back to we skipped a couple verses there, but basically he started by mocking the Jews. Like, if a fox were to come up and jump on this pile of rubble that they're kind of piling up, then it would fall over. And when they realized that mocking wasn't going to work, then they says, it's in the Bible, I'm serious. What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think that they can build a wall in a single day just by offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of stones, rubbish from that heap of chard at once? Verse 3. Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, that stone wall would collapse if even a fox walked along the top of it. Then I prayed, hear us, O God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their own heads. May they themselves become captives in a foreign land. Nehemiah knows that, he knows the Proverbs, he knows that to answer a fool is foolish. And so instead of responding back to them, he just prays. And that's oftentimes the best thing to do is when we're being attacked, to not respond, just to pray to God to give us strength and courage. Do not ignore their guilt. Do not blot out their sins, for they have provoked you to anger here in front of the builders. And then, now we kind of transition. At last, half the wall was completed to half its height around the city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and Ammonites and Ashdodites heard that the work was going ahead and the gaps in the wall were being repaired, they were furious. Mocking doesn't work. They're too focused on this one thing. Then they made plans to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw us into confusion. But we prayed to our God and guarded the city day and night to protect ourselves. Then the people of Judah began to complain. The workers are getting tired. And there's so much rubble to be moved. We will never be able to build the wall by ourselves. Ever been in a pity party? Meanwhile, our enemies were saying, before they'll know what's happening, we'll swoop down on them and kill them and end their work. The Jews who lived near the enemy came and told us again and again, they will come from all directions and attack us. And so Nehemiah knows that discouragement is setting in. And the wall's only half done. And so he pulls everybody together and he rallies them back to the vision. And He sets up a plan. He places guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas. He stations people to stand guard by families armed with swords, spears, and bows. Then as I looked over the situation, I called together the nobles and the rest of the people and said to them, "Don't be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord who is great and glorious, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." When our enemies heard that we knew of their plans and that God had frustrated them, we returned to our work on the wall. But from then on, only half my men worked, while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. The leaders stationed themselves behind the people of Judah who were building the wall. The laborers carried on with their work, with one hand supporting their load and one hand holding a weapon. All the builders had a sword strapped to their side, and the trumpeter stayed with me to sound the alarm. And basically Nehemiah is like, okay, there's an honest threat here because they could come in. And so instead of just kind of naively thinking that everything's just going to go on as normal, let's set up a plan so that if they try something, we'll be ready for them. And it frustrates Sanballat and Tobiah. And they may have been just sending them as a rumor to try to intimidate. They may have actually been planning something. We don't really know. But either way, Nehemiah was going to be ready for them because he's focused on the one thing and nothing's going to stop them from rebuilding the wall. Moving on to Nehemiah 6 is where we get to a little bit of the core message that I want to share with us today. And it's in a response that Nehemiah gives back to Sanballat and Tobiah. We're reading, starting in Nehemiah 6:1. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies found out that I had finished rebuilding the wall, and that no gaps remained, though we had not set up the doors and the gates. This is a perfect time to kind of maybe let your foot off the gas. The wall's rebuilt, but it doesn't have any doors on the gates yet. So Sanballat and Geshem sent a message asking me to meet them at one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But I realized they were plotting to harm me. And here's what Nehemiah says back. And I kind of envision this scene kind of like a messenger's coming up and he's saying, okay, well, where's Nehemiah? I have a message for him. And he goes, he's up on the wall there. It's like, Nehemiah, Sanballat and Tobiah want you to meet them on the plain of Ono in one of the villages. And Nehemiah shouts back, I am engaged in a great work, so I can't come and meet with you. Why should I stop working to come and meet with you? I am engaged in a great work and I cannot come. Why should I stop working to come and meet with you? Some translations say I cannot come down, implying that he really was like up on the wall working along with the men. And 4 times they sent the same message, and each time he gave the same reply. I'm engaged in a great work and I cannot come down. And the 5th time, wanting to intimidate him even more, Sanballat's servant came with an open letter in his hand, and this is what it said. There's a rumor among the surrounding nations, and Geshem tells me it's true, that you and the Jews are planning to rebel, and that's why you're rebuilding the wall. According to his reports, you plan to be their king. He also reports that you appointed prophets in Jerusalem to proclaim about you, look, there's a king in Judah. You can be very sure that this report will get back to the king, so I suggest that you come and talk it over with me. Nehemiah replies, there's no truth in any part of your story. Nehemiah has integrity, and he has to have shown his integrity to King Artaxerxes for King Artaxerxes to have even let him come down there. And so he's just basically calling Sanballat's bluff. There's no truth in any part of your story. You're making the whole thing up. They were just trying to intimidate us, imagining that they could discourage us and stop the work. So I continued the work with even greater determination. And as we skip down to the bottom part of Nehemiah, verse 15, on October 2nd, the wall was finished, just 52 days after they'd begun. Imagine building a wall for an entire city in just 52 days. That's focus, intensity on the one thing, if there's ever any focus, intensity on the one thing. And when our enemies heard about it and the surrounding nations heard about it, they were frightened and humiliated. They realized that this work had been done with the help of our God.